Hi, this is Generous Theology. What are you reading in the new year? Chuck and Brock review reading they've done from the past year, and contemplate possibilities for new reading.
So Chuck, you and I, we're just looking back on the year that was. We're almost at the end of 2021 for what it's worth at the time we record this. And Chuck, we were talking about our reading lists. I have a good friend who posted on social media what he had read this year, and it was just fabulous. I would say, looking at the list, he wanted to read about 40 books. I think he ended up reading about 22 theology books, and then maybe parts of other ones. But it was just an explosive year for him, and we talked about that. And when you think about reading material and planning, Chuck, and you say to yourself, hey, I want to invest time, I want to invest some dollars in purchasing the reading materials. You mentioned that you had a structure in general. Not everything is completely structured, of course, but you mentioned that it's important to you to manage, lay it out, try to cover ground efficiently, maybe just putting words in your mouth. What sort of strategies do you want to use when you're trying to plan what you're going to read in the next year or in the next 6 months?
Yeah. So one of the things that I always do, so I use the Goodreads app, and that really helps me track what I'm reading. And I tend to be an eclectic reader, which means that I'm reading a lot of different styles, a lot of different types of books. I know your friend who had read 20 plus theology books in the year. I went and checked my Goodreads, and this year, thus far, I've read 80 books, and of which 10 of the books that I finished, I think you could qualify as theology. Some of them aren't straight theology, but they come close. And I also have a number that I'm still in, that I'm working through. What I tend to do is I always have one or two books that are easy read. If I'm tired, if I've had a long day, I want to read. I don't want to just sit and veg out in front of the TV or just fall asleep or something. So I will often pull those up, and I always have a list of those. And actually, there's a number of, especially in the mystery area, there are a number, and science fiction as well, there are a number of series that I will work through as well. But then I always make sure to have a couple of more deep books that I'm reading through either on my own or with people. I'm in a large number of book clubs. I would count you and I's discussions as one of those book clubs, but there are at least 4 other groups of people that I read books with that probably count as a book club. And so I've always got something going with those. And then just whatever else interests me. So for example, right now, and I've always have a number of books open. If I get tired of something, I can always put that down, read a little in something else and wake my brain up, or whatever. Like right now, I'm finishing up Reformed Dogmatics Volume 4. I've been going through the entire series slowly. I'm hoping to finish Volume 4 by the end of this year. So that's pretty deep reading, as is the reading we do for our discussions on medieval philosophy. One of my other book clubs, we tend to read, we go back and forth between Christian life kind of stuff and doctrine kind of stuff. We have a member of that group who really loves A.W. Tozer, so we're reading The Pursuit of God together. And in fact, I'll be finishing that in the next day or two as well. And another group that where I read with a number of pastors, we're reading a theology book as well called A Time to Keep, Theology, Mortality, and I don't see what the rest of the title is, but you get the sense. It's a discussion of the theology of death and life and how we speak about death and life. And he makes some comments about how we've maybe moved away from understanding what death is really all about, and how that hurts our theology. But on top of that, I typically do have some fun stuff going that's just a little lighter. I'm currently reading Gregory Benford science fiction novel, for example, that just came out called Shadows of Eternity. It was just published earlier this year, and it was in the new books over at the library, so I picked it up. And so I'll do stuff like that as well. Or I'm working through C.J. Box, a novelist who writes Western mystery novels where the main character is a game warden in Wyoming. So I've been working through those, and that's a lot of fun too. And having that kind of reading in addition to the deeper stuff keeps my brain a little fresh at times. And then that way, if I run into difficulty, like earlier this year, there's a series of books by the Norwegian author Karl Ove Knausgaard, and his series of 6 books was called My Struggle, and it's this really super detailed story of his life, and it's this half memoir way of writing, and there were times when I really got bogged down in that too, and so I just needed to do something a little lighter. And same thing if I'm reading, like this year I read some Dostoevsky during the summer, and occasionally that would get a little, when the sun's out and you're reading this Russian literature, it gets a little depressing. So I just got to read something a little lighter and enjoy the sun and then go back to it. And that gives me the ability to not just quit when the going gets tough. How about you? Do you use any particular strategies? I know you were talking a little bit before we started recording about some of the things that you do to keep it fresh and make sure that you keep reading.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking. I like to reread things that I have previously read. I would say maybe 20 to 30%, maybe around a third on the high end of content that I read every year is a reread. I don't know what it is, Chuck, but for some reason, if it went down good the first time, I would like for it to go down good a second time. And I have found so much blessing in that. There are friends, I sometimes count books as friends, and there are just some old friends that I have had for decades in that regard. I will just share with you, the structure is not very structured. It is not particularly planned out. So I do some level of planning. For example, you and I have committed to going through Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, Reformed Ethics, the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy, and those have been very profitable for me. But just these past 2 weeks, I went on a tear and reread Isaac Asimov's autobiography, the first 2 volumes of it. He wrote 2 volumes of an autobiography that were published in the late 70s, I think 1978. In Joy Still Felt, In Memory Yet Green. They were early biographies. Now, he did later biographical material, I think in the late 80s, that for some reason I just don't devour it as quickly. I don't think any the worse of it, but I was really impressed by those autobiographical volumes he wrote in the 1970s. And I don't know why. I just, perhaps if I'm a fanboy, let's use that term, a fanboy of any one particular individual writer, it would have been Isaac Asimov. And it was actually always a goal of mine while he was alive, and I was a younger man, much younger man now. It was always a goal of mine to have met him. And I was, of course, deeply shocked at his passing in the early 90s, which is almost 30 years now. And I can't tell you where the time is going, because reading his works, I always felt an immediacy of his voice. In other words, when I would read his books, I felt like I was in the room sitting with him and we were having a conversation, only he was doing all of the talking, which is, believe it or not, how I actually like most of my interactions. People are going to think from listening to us on this that I just love to talk. And maybe that's true to some degree, but I love to listen as much as I love to talk. And reading Isaac Asimov is science fiction as well as his fiction. I almost feel I knew him personally, which, of course, I didn't. And what an influence, what a tremendous person in my life. And like I said, I was devastated when he died, even more from a Christian perspective, thinking about eternity and his eternal situation. So I've read for the last almost 30 years his works, but in a sort of a very bittersweet way. And if somebody has read Asimov, they might have picked up on his buoyant self-optimism, his jubilant nature, his extremely je ne sais quoi. I'm going to throw that out there. That's my French phrase. He just had this way of, when I read him, not only did I feel like he was in the room, but he would always be there. He just felt timeless and immortal to me. So when he did pass in the early 90s, I really was shocked. And when the New Atheism happened in the early 2000s, I was greatly saddened because I had fallen in love with an atheist writer. And in my thinking, there was really no reason for atheists and Christians to be caustically and eristically at war with one another. And so the last 15 years has been a great bother to me. because lots of people who I would have been happy to have been friends with are on the other side, quote unquote, or they're part of the other tribe. And the rip in the fabric has happened in our society. And it's a rip that I don't welcome. And I mourn, Chuck, because I love to read the great thinkers, Christian as well as non-Christian. And to have this idea today that not part of the approved tribe, or maybe instead of speaking tribally, maybe think about, some people talk about the Overton window, which is a window of acceptable dialogue, and how the window for different segments of the culture has shifted and moved content. So in a Christian context, many of my Christian friends just will not read atheists on principle. They are outside of the tribe. They're, quote unquote, the bad guy. They don't have the scriptures, they don't love God, and so therefore there's not much point in spending a lot of time reading them. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm in love with all the atheists. I have not had the success reading other atheist writers that I have with reading Asimov, but I really have. I really could not imagine life being so beautiful to me, this good life that God has given, without having been able to read him. And so I do mourn for that breakdown in the fabric there. And it's tough because I think sometimes I almost feel like I'm in a relationship with the author. And of course, if I would meet the author out on the street, I would come up and give them a hug like they were my closest kin. And of course, they wouldn't know me from any other person. I just wondered, Chuck, have you ever found that special author or two for you that maybe you really bonded with in an exceptional sort of way? And if so, how has that enriched you or been a part of your reading life?
It's interesting. First of all, as Asimov goes, I have the same sense as you do. I haven't read, I don't think, as much of Asimov. I have not read his biography. But as a kid, both preteen and teenager, I read quite a bit of Asimov. And not just his fiction, but also some of his commentaries and science-type books. And I remember as a teenager or even as a preteen reading some of his nonfiction, even though I didn't read his autobiographies or his memoirs, and really getting a sense of who he was. And in fact, I remember probably at about 10 or 11 years old, even asking my father a little bit about how somebody like this who is so really smart, and yet if based on what we believe about who's going to heaven, sounds like he might not go. And my dad made a couple of good points. One being we don't know that, and you don't know what may happen at the end of his life. At that point, he was still living. And he also made the point, to as much as a 10 or 11-year-old can understand, that there is this thing called common grace, and God spreads his gift to all sorts of people, including those who reject the fact that God has even given them those gifts, and yet he spreads them out in all sorts of ways and just tosses those gifts out to the world in almost a way that just seems, sometimes to us, might even seem wasteful, right? Because he just throws them everywhere, and yet as a result of that, there's so much in the world. Some other authors, another author who I think his worldview, you and I would disagree with much of it, but who I've really connected with, is a fiction writer by the name of John Irving. And John Irving, I will say, for those who might be listening to us, if you go out and start reading John Irving, some of the books are really good and some of them I would not recommend. But the ones that are really good, and there is so much there. And John Irving, he has a real ability to get into the minds and thoughts of flawed, imperfect people and express what's going on in their life. I really enjoyed, for example, A Prayer for Owen Meany is a book that he wrote. And I'm sure there are a lot of Christians who would be like, that's one of your favorite books of all time. And yeah, it is. And there's so much there that we can learn about sin and about human nature from a book like that, even from an author who would not hold to our view of those things. And yet we can learn a lot from him. And then one of the other interesting things is thinking about connecting with writers. Every once in a while, I've had the opportunity to either read books by people that I've known, that I had previously met even before they started writing. There is a book that's out there right now making waves in the evangelical world called Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobus Dumais. And Kristen Kobus, before she was Kristen Kobus Dumais, grew up in the same town that I did. She was a number of years behind me in the schools that I went to. And my mother actually taught her, I think, in third grade. But so it's cool to read an author like that, where when I'm reading her, whether I'm agreeing with every statement she makes or not, there is a connection that I can make, that I can understand a little bit where she's coming from on some things. And then the flip side of that is meeting people that I've read and really appreciated and then getting to know them. One of those is Al Walters, who is the writer of Creation Regained, which is just an unbelievable book, and probably is also another one. If I had to list the 5 books that most influenced me other than the Bible, Creation Regained is definitely on that list. And I got to meet Al Walters many years after he wrote the book. He wrote the book in the 80s. I read it for the first time in college in the mid to late 80s. And then it must have been probably 4 years ago now, I went up to Hamilton, Ontario. We did a vacation up in the Toronto area, in the Niagara Falls area. And my daughter was considering colleges, and one place she wanted to consider was Redeemer University College in Hamilton, Ontario, which is a good Reformed Christian university up there in Canada. And Al Walters is retired from there and still lives there. And lo and behold, he was there on campus. And I got to have lunch with them and my wife as well, and my kids. And he signed our copies of Creation Regained, which was pretty cool. And we've been able to keep in touch a little bit since then, not like every day or anything like that, but just keep in touch a little bit. And now he's got some health challenges, and I'm concerned about those things. But it's good to have somebody now when I pray for him, it's not just somebody who wrote some book that I'd read, but it's a person that I really met and I had good conversations with, and learned a little bit about his background and how he ended up where he's at, which was just really a great opportunity. And people who have favorite authors like that, especially if they're writing in the kind of areas where they can have a great impact on you and they're not like multi-million selling authors, so they might be a little more reachable or a little more able to make contact with them. I'd encourage people to do that. It's really a great opportunity. And I found in most of those cases, the authors that I've talked to that are also very open to it and are interested in engaging with people who've read them, including people who've read them and have questions or concerns about some of the things in their writing and want to honestly engage with it rather than just attack. Or the other thing that can happen is people sometimes just fawn, and I don't think the authors always like that so much either. So yeah, good stuff. Do you have any favorite authors that you've ever had an opportunity to meet and talk to, whether in person or perhaps in social media?
I have almost no personal interactions in real life with celebrity authors. I will say this, about 15 years ago, I was helping to edit the Wikipedia page for Professor John Frame. And I just sent an email to him saying, "Hi, I'm editing a biographical page for you on Wikipedia. Do you have a photo that you could share?" And he did. So he wrote me back and he shared a photo. And I used it and I put it in the Wikipedia page. It's long since been removed. This was before the content restrictions now make it much more difficult to get content onto Wikipedia. And I frankly don't understand the new rules. So maybe they're not that onerous, but I've just never taken the time to do. I did try to document the provenance and mention in there that I had received these photos directly from Professor Frame, but I think that wasn't sufficient. I looked maybe 5 years ago or something back at the page, and the photos were gone, and I think my text edits had been taken up as well with rewrites and such. And so I was a little disappointed, maybe understanding of the Wikipedia experience. Maybe this is growth that's healthy. It didn't feel like it to me. So that was as close as I've had to maybe interacting with any luminaries, authors that are in my library. I think that, and of course, Asimov, I have tried to similarly get into reading folks like Carl Sagan and Sam Harris. So I've said to myself, I love Asimov. Maybe I can find something special like I had with him with those other authors. And I don't hold anything against those other authors, but I've just not had the same level of engagement with them. I will say this, though. I do really enjoy reading James Lindsay and not just reading his books, but his listening to his podcasts. So he's an atheist thinker who has really documented well the Marxist nature of modern critical methods, including things like critical race theory. He's also been quite stridently anti-Christian, so he's a part of the new atheism movement. I have, I think, 2 of his books in my library that are actually dedicated to have an anti-Christian focus and application. And so I am impressed by him. I couldn't get into Carl Sagan as well, and I couldn't get into Sam Harris as well, but that might be me. That might not be them. That might be me. I'm trying to think about some other authors. I've been very pleased with the level of light that has come about in the past 20 years, let's say. And I'd love to check for feedback with you on this. Around the year 2000, Chuck, which is roughly when I started engaging in the study of theology on a serious level, those early years, maybe from 2000 to 2005, finding good quality sources was a challenge. And I had a really hard time finding good quality works. They were just hard to find, just rare, scarce, not particularly hidden. Just people didn't have them as much. But then maybe around 2005 to 2010, the content became available and became so widely available, so richly available, that now I just have an embarrassing amount of riches in my library. If you would have told me in the year 2000 how large my library would be here in 2021, I would have counted it a miracle, because things were really hard to come by. And I wonder if people forget about that. And I also wonder if that was somehow your experience as well, or maybe availabilities can vary on region and environment and such. How was it for you maybe earlier in life with accessing quality materials?